this passage is about clockwork mechanisms, active passive theories, and evolutionary biology and what it thinks about it. Let's quickly summarize the passage before we look at the questions. The model of nature as a cosmic complex mechanism has been central to modern science ever since the 17th century. So that the concept, the model of nature, seeing nature as a complex clockwork mechanism has been there for a long time, since the 17th century. It continues to appear regularly throughout the sciences from quantum mechanics to evolutionary biology. This model of complex clockwork mechanism appears in quantum mechanics, appears in evolutionary biology and other branches of science. For René Descartes and his contemporaries, mechanism did not signify the sort of inert, regular, predictable functioning that the word connotes today. So if I say mechanism today, what does it connote? Something that's routine, inert, passive. But in Descartes' time, for him and his contemporaries, this was not what mechanism conveyed. Instead, it often suggested the very opposite: responsiveness, engagement, and caprice. Yet, over the course of the 17th century, the idea of machinery has narrowed into something passive without agency or force of its own. For Descartes, it meant responsiveness, caprice, the idea that we have now developed over the course of the 17th century. Active and the earlier notion of active responsive mechanism largely gave way to a new brute mechanism. Earlier mechanism was active, responsive. Then the perception became, the newer perception was of a brute passive mechanism. Active and passive mechanism jostled for primacy in the life sciences throughout the 18th century into the 9th. There was this conflict of which is primary, which is more important, which is more influential throughout the 18th century almost into the 19th. This struggle was extremely productive. What was the result of that? By the end of the 18th century, active mechanist philosophy had generated the first theories of species change. Turn of the century, this active mechanism had come up with their own theory of species change. Because order came from within for active mechanism, rather than being delivered all at once and from the outside, it became important to imagine how organized features of the natural world might have emerged over time, not as a static structure, but a pattern process. They came up with a theory that order came from within, not from outside. So they came up with a theory of how organized features of the natural world came about. Yet, this is as far as active mechanism is concerned. But brute mechanism continued its onward journey. William Paley, a Christian philosopher active in the 18th and 19th century, represents passive mechanism at its most influential. Paley defended the idea of a designer god using the analogy of a watch on the heath. If you tripped over a stone while you were out walking, he said, you might suppose it had always been there. When you're walking, if you trip over a stone, so stone is there on the ground, it's anyway there. But if you tripped over a watch, you could hardly make the same supposition. If you trip over a watch, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Oh, it is natural for the watch to be on the ground. That's not what you'll think. What will you think? Whose watch is it? How come it is there? Right? So, what does that mean? So, the beautiful living clockwork of nature must point to the presence of a divine watchmaker. But Paley's argument assumes that the watch is passive as a stone lying on the heath waiting to be kicked aside. A moving, self-constituting and self-transforming watch would imply something else entirely. But for Paley, a watch depicted something passive. Somebody has to kick me before all this came about. But if you think of the watch as a moving, self-constituting, self-transforming watch, then the conclusions, your thinking would change. Today, the tension between active and passive mechanisms is still evident. Where is it evident? In evolutionary biology. While evolutionary theorists reject creationism Of course, concepts such as adaptation and fitness are in fact grounded in a passive mechanistic view of living structures. So, active mechanist theories, they reject the idea of creationism, but they have these concepts of adaptation and fitness. And what are these? These are grounded in passive mechanistic views of living structures. That view has traditionally banned any talk of evolutionary agency within living organisms. So when you talk of evolutionary agency in terms of adaptation, the active theorists don't say it comes from within the living organism. What does it say? It says that these forms and structures, these adaptations happen because of external forces. At the same time, evolutionary theory retains an important inheritance from the active mechanistic tradition. But these two parts of of evolutionary mechanism is passive. There are many other parts of of evolutionary theory which relies on active mechanistic traditions. What are they? Active mechanistic ideas seem currently to be on the ascendant. So many of the theories of evolution still have active mechanistic tradition, and that is becoming more and more important. Ascendant means rising. Recent work on niche construction, for example, attends to the ways that organisms can shape their environment, which in turn shape them through natural selection. One of the examples he has given, that organisms shape the environment shapes organisms in terms of natural selection. Meanwhile, research in epigenetics examines how organisms can transform in response to their environment in heritable ways. That means organisms can change and respond to the environment in ways that they can pass it down. It is a heritable trait. Rather than being purely passive recipients of environmental pressures, organisms are active, self-transforming according to current research. So what is the current research saying in evolutionary biology saying? Organisms are not purely passive recipients of environment. They are active and they are self-transforming. According to these scientists, life is still fundamentally mechanistic in the sense that it is made of mechanical parts and forces. So how is it fundamentally mechanistic? In terms of the mechanistic parts and forces, with no spirits or supernatural puppeteers to make it go. Life goes on, it has its own mechanistic parts, it moves on. There is no supernatural being who makes it go. But if living things are machines, they are looking more and more like responsive and disquiet ones in a perpetual state of flux and restlessness. But if you call living things machines, they are not the quiet machines which are immobile. They are machines which are responsive and they are always in a state of change or flux. Okay, so that's the synopsis of our first passage. Question 1. Which one of the following sets of words or phrases best serves as the key words to the passage? So you get a lot of terms. This is the most current form of CAT question in terms of what's the main point of the author. So they can either ask you what's the main point of the author, or they want to see whether you understand the flow of ideas in the passage. Then this is the question that is asked. Set of words or phrases which represents the keywords. So you have to not just look at keywords, you also to look at it in the order in which they appear, right? Each paragraph has a keyword. Maybe 2 paragraphs can be summed up in one keyword, but the key here is all the keywords have to be mentioned and in the order in which they appear. One leads to the other. Active mechanism, yes, no. So when we look at the passage without looking at the answer options, how did the author start? By talking of what is the meaning of mechanism, right? What is the meaning of mechanism in Descartes' time and in the current time, and how it changed through the 17th century, and what is the current meaning of mechanism. Active versus brute mechanism. Later he calls the same brute mechanism passive mechanism, but he does mention brute mechanism in the earlier parts of the second paragraph and then third paragraph, and then moves on to call it passive mechanism. Then he talks of this conflict of active and passive mechanism, especially found in evolutionary biology. right? And then he says, right now in evolutionary biology, when he mentions passive mechanism, he mentions Paley and the watchmaker analogy. After that, when he talks of evolutionary biology, he talks of how evolutionary biology is on the ascendant, right? He says that individuals are machines, they are mechanistic in terms of having mechanistic parts, but at the same time, they are not passive machines, they are responsive, self-transforming machines. This is what he has said. So these words, as far as possible in that order, has to be there in our correct answer. Active mechanism, passive mechanism, clockwork, Paley, evolutionary agency. Active mechanism, yes. Passive mechanism, yes. In the middle, he also mentions brute mechanism. Later, he calls it active mechanism. That is missing. Second, clockwork and Paley come under the same. Clockwork can also refer to the first one, that we all basically science thinks of nature as a clockwork mechanism. So clockwork here is a general key word which has appeared throughout the passage rather than a keyword which appeared after passive mechanism. The other problem is the part where he describes individuals as mechanisms which are responsive and self-transforming has not been mentioned. Rather, he's spoken of only evolutionary agencies. So that kind of misses out certain keywords. So A cannot be a correct answer. What about B? Active mechanism, brute mechanism, passive mechanism, self-transforming. So passive mechanism, after that he says how evolutionary biology thinks of individuals as self-transforming organisms. So that is important. And then evolutionary theory and about how organisms relate to the evolution. Good one. To the environment. B seems to cover all the keywords. Let's look at option C. Active mechanism, evolutionary theory, adaptation, fitness, natural selection. Hasn't mentioned the key word, which is passive mechanism. So 3 is incomplete. C is incomplete. Organisms, passive mechanism, supernatural puppeteers, niche construction, epigenetics, doesn't mention active mechanism. Therefore, the correct answer is obviously B, which sums up all the keywords perfectly. I hope you got that right. Question 2. The author claims that view has traditionally banned any talk of evolutionary agency within living organisms. He is talking about the view of active mechanistic theorists on evolutionary changes like adaptation and other things, right? That view has traditionally banned any talk of evolutionary agency within living organisms and instead ascribed their forms and structures to forces acting out from outside them. So active mechanistic theory rejects creationism, but their idea of adaptation and such theories are actually passive mechanistic because they believe that changes in an individual, evolutionary changes, happen because of forces that act outside them, not from inside. That's exactly what it's saying. The question is asking us to explain this sentence. We'll look at an option which goes closest to our understanding of the sentence. Living organisms have no agency in shaping their forms and structures. They are solely determined by external forces. That's an extreme word, solely determined by external forces. He didn't say that, so that is, because the use of the extreme word, that is not the correct answer. B. Evolutionary theory acknowledges the agency of living organisms in shaping their forms and structures through natural selection. That is the second one. It acknowledges the agency of living organisms in shaping their forms and structures through natural selection. Do living organisms shape their forms and structures through natural selection? Is that what the evolutionary theory says? What does it say? Any changes are from outside. Adaptation, natural selection changes individuals. It is not living organisms by themselves who change. So this contradicts what the author is saying and what this line is saying. The mechanistic view of living organisms has traditionally banned discussions of their form being determined by forces outside them. Has traditionally banned the discussion of their form being determined by forces outside them. Ban any talk of evolutionary agency within the living organism. They say don't say that evolutionary organism is within the living organism. They have not banned the other one. The other one is what they believe in, that living things are changed by forces outside them. They have not banned the discussion of that. So this twists what has been said in the passage. The view in evolutionary theory posits that, puts forward this theory that living organisms are passive recipients of environmental pressure. They ascribe their forms and structures to forces outside them. So they get their form and structure by forces acting outside them. They are not their own contributors to any evolution. Therefore, the correct answer is D. Clear? None of the following statements is implied by the arguments of the passage except, that means which is the option which is implied by the author and the passage. The struggle between active and passive mechanisms may not have had a significant impact on the life sciences post the 19th century. We do not know. The author has said it had a significant impact in the 18th and to the 19th century, through the 18th into the 19th century. The author has not mentioned anything about post-19th century. We do not know because whether he implies anything or not, because he hasn't mentioned post-19th century. So this option is irrelevant. The concept of mechanism in the 17th century does not always have the same connotation as it does today. True. Why? Because Descartes' concept of mechanism was very different from the new concept. Descartes thought of mechanism as responsive, caprice. It signified responsiveness, caprice, all that. Later it came to be seen as inert, right? Passive and quiet. So that is correct. The early 17th century and later, there was a big difference in the perception of or the view of what is mechanism. So B is implied by the author. B is our answer. Let's quickly look at C and D. The theory of evolution rejects the idea of a creator and advocates an active mechanistic view of living organisms. It rejects the idea of creationism, but at the same time, remember, the author says that some of their evolutionary theories, some parts of the evolutionary theories are based in passive mechanism. So it doesn't totally reject the idea of creationism. It doesn't totally advocate an active mechanistic view of living organisms. That hasn't been implied by the author. Recent research in epigenetics suggests that organisms may have some self-transforming features but are largely unresponsive. It's the exact opposite. Organisms are self-transforming. The unresponsiveness is not correct. That's what recent research believes. Therefore, the correct answer is B. Question 4. The author claims that, but if living things are machines, they are looking more and more like responsive and disquiet ones. Disquiet means restless. In a perpetual state of flux and restlessness. Which one of the following statements best expresses the point being made by the author here? Whenever you're getting a quote from the passage, simplify it in your own words. If you accept that we are machines, we are not machines in the sense of passive, inert creatures. We are machines in the form of, we are responsive machines, we are disquiet machines, we are machines which are constantly in a state of change and restlessness. That's what he's saying. Let's look at the options. The idea that living things are machines is a recent development in the field of biology. Is it what the option means? The statement means? No. The concept of passive mechanism is no longer relevant in modern evolutionary history. Don't you think that's a sweeping way of saying it? Modern evolutionary biology, certain parts of it is still grounded in active mechanistic tradition, passive mechanistic traditions, right? So B cannot be correct. The active mechanist tradition and its emphasis on self-transformation and responsiveness are gaining currency in contemporary biology because it is on the ascendant, he says. Yes, it's gaining currency, it's gaining significance, it's gaining influence. Therefore, option C is the correct answer.